Mirror's Edge Catalyst is the perfect example of how to not make a sequel. Developed by DICE, known for their work on the Battlefield franchise, it's a sequel that takes all the elements that everyone liked from the first game and flushes them right down the toilet. It's been released for Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Now, this is a reboot to the original game. Why they thought this was necessary is beyond me, but anyway, you once again play as Faith, a runner in the utopian/dystopian city of Glass. In the game's opening, Faith is released from prison and begins working with the rebel leader named Noah, alongside paying off a debt for an old employer named Dogan. Glass is under rule by a guy named Kruger and his forces known as KSEC, who patrol the rooftops and shoot at runners like Faith on sight. They all wear masks to cover their faces to make sure you know they're the bad guys. There's no conflicts or alternate points of view here, it's just you're the good guys fighting back against the man, and people doing their job trying to stop you are the enemies. We never see life from the viewpoint of the normal citizens, we never even see the city from the ground because apparently it's too dangerous. So for all we know, the runners are just a pack of crazy assholes fighting back for no reason. There is a sense of conflict, however, between the rebel group, split up between those who are seeking a more peaceful solution to whatever it is they're fighting, and those who are after a more violent outcome to their problems. The group for the latter is led by a woman, of course, named Rebecca Thane, but this power struggle ultimately goes nowhere as the goal and overall objective seems to change like every single mission. I had no interest in any of the stuff going on in this game at all. I found the characters extremely cliche and stereotypical, and I found Faith to be just really unlikable with a sullen, bored attitude that made her just very tedious as a protagonist. She just kind of stands around in the cinematics looking brooding and uninterested. Side characters are forgettable for the most part. There's the quirky, geeky girl who's good with computers and talks a mile a minute. Then there's the brash punk kid trope we've seen 100 times.
Thank you. Would be nice.
I'm gonna get some sleep.
The voice acting isn't terrible though, so at least it's got that going for it, but let's just say you're not going to be glued to the cinematics or anything like that.
Careful with that mouth, girl.
First thing I noticed when playing though was just how horrible the visuals look. Now, in terms of the design and aesthetic of the City of Glass, it doesn't look too bad. I mean, it has a nice sterile art style that really conforms with the whole dystopian, totalitarian thing they're going for, but there's some huge issues with the engine. Normally games running on the Frostbite engine look half decent, but Mirror's Edge Catalyst just looks really piss poor. There's problems with texture streaming, there's blurry textures in general, and it just doesn't look very appealing. I'm convinced there's some sort of issue going on with the engine because it just looks far too horrible for it to be made this way on purpose, and keep in mind I'm running this on the so-called Ultra setting. At least the city is bustling though. You'll often see other runners practicing their free running on the rooftops. You can look over the edge and see traffic down below, and there's also random KSEC patrols scattered around as well. It feels like an actual place instead of a series of jungle gym themed rooftops like what we got in the first game. People who watch my videos on this channel know that I didn't really enjoy Mirror's Edge, but I did give credit where credit is due, and one aspect the game did at least manage to somewhat nail was the feeling of running across rooftops, looking down at the streets below from dizzying heights. The sense of speed and motion when you chain together your moveset to seamlessly traverse the urban landscape made for some enthralling gameplay. The free running or whatever it's called was linear but polished, and it seems to have been carried across here as well when the game recognises what you're trying to accomplish and you don't fall to your death. There's a pretty generous checkpoint system here as well, where the game saves your position often moments before you fall to your death, which is handy as long as you weren't in a bad position before you actually died. And yet for some reason, DICE have decided to turn Mirror's Edge Catalyst into an open world game, because I guess that's what everyone is doing these days. And along with the open world comes everything you'd expect. You've got safe houses, you've got fast travel, you've got side tasks, and then you've got side missions, most of which are just timed, requiring you to run through a series of waypoints in a time limit. People who care about being ranked on leaderboards can take part in dashes, which are the short preset routes that you try to complete as fast as possible and beat someone in another part of the world by like half a second or whatever. There's an illusion of having this whole huge city to explore, but often to get to the place you need, there'll be like one or two routes to get there, and the game even uses a thing called Runner Vision to show you the exact way to go. It does seem like a cop-out, but getting where you need to go otherwise becomes incredibly confusing. One of the new inclusions is a mag rope, which is a fancy way of saying grappling hook that you use to swing across gaps, grapple up to a higher vantage point, and pull apart weak walls. Another new addition is the focus meter. Now when you're running, you're building up focus, which when full increases your movement speed and makes enemies about as accurate as Imperial Stormtroopers. Of course, focus takes a nosedive as soon as you hit a ladder or climb a pipe, and there's very specific routes you take in the story missions to keep it stocked up whilst also taking out the bad guys. In terms of the combat itself, this really is, I think, one of the worst melee combat systems I've seen in a first-person game, especially a AAA game, and especially a game where the central focus of the combat is all around melee. For some reason, Faith is unable to hold guns because they're supposed to be like linked by DNA to their users or something like that, which is fine, I can deal with that. It made sense in Judge Dredd, so why not? It wouldn't be an issue if the melee wasn't so goddamn awful. Remember in the first game how crappy the combat was, but it was alright because you could run away from like 90% of the fights. Yeah, well, bad luck now, son Jim, because you're gonna have to fight back in this game frequently. You often can't progress until you finish beating a couple dozen guys senseless, because that's exactly what we needed more of. Melee combat has at least been expanded, I'll give them that. There's a few different attacks depending on which button you're pressing and your position. You can shift or dodge around enemies to avoid them, and there's about 5 variants of enemies all up. There's your standard lighter enemy types, there's enemies armed with guns who just stand back and shoot at you like total assholes, and then there's the tougher, bigger enemy types who can floor you with one hit. They're all generally countered with the same techniques, it's just the tougher enemies are able to evade a few of your moves. Overall, there's a big focus on stumbling enemies, like you can kick an enemy on their side, sending them bumping into someone standing next to them. Apparently because if 2 people bump into each other, that renders them unconscious. Just like in the Three Stooges, how hitting someone on the top of the head with a metal object knocks them out. I could spend a whole video talking about how bad the combat is, but I mean, just look at it. The physics are just ludicrous and it feels really unpolished and unrefined. Like someone will trip over a crate or a box and that will incapacitate them. Or an enemy can somehow tumble over a waist-high railing and fall to his death. It's astonishing how bad it is. There's an entire skill tree devoted to combat alone, and upgrading it almost becomes a necessity. Oh yeah, the game has an upgrade system, because again, I guess you can't make an open world game in 2016 without including some kind of upgrade system for your character. All that XP and those recycled side missions have to add up to something, right? A lot of the movement-based upgrades are also moves that you had from the get-go in the first game as well, like doing the 180 wall jump or rolling on the point of impact to lessen the fall damage. Yep, you gotta unlock them. Strangely too, the game will give you these upgrades for free at certain points in the story missions, so if you happen to already spend a point unlocking them, then sucks to be you. I don't know what I expected a Mirror's Edge reboot to be like, but I sure as hell didn't expect, nor do I want this. It's bland, it's generic, it's uninspired, and it's just underwhelming. And it's funny how taking a linear game into an open world setting and adding in more activities to complete than you can poke a stick at actually made it worse off. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is disappointing and overall a worse game than its predecessor, and coming from someone who disliked that game, you know it can't be good.
There. Good. Both of you get back here. Stay out of sight of the peatholes.